Moses never received the Ten Commandments from God. This is the conclusion of Baruch Spinoza, the Jewish philosopher who shook the foundations of 3,000 years of religious tradition with an analysis so precise, so devastating, that it forever changed the way humanity reads sacred texts. Spinoza was not an atheist trying to destroy religion. He was a genius who knew the Torah better than any rabbi, a thinker who applied mathematical logic to the most sacred narrative of Judaism. And what he discovered was so explosive that it resulted in his excommunication, the banning of his books, and centuries of forced silence about his ideas. But the truth does not die. And today you will understand exactly why Spinoza claimed that the story of Mount Sinai, the stone tablets, the voice of God thundering in the desert, never happened the way we were told. The Bible says that Moses wrote the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, but the text itself describes the death of Moses. How can a dead man write about his own death? The Bible mentions cities that would only exist centuries later. How did Moses know the names of places that did not yet exist? The Bible presents 2 different versions of the 10 Commandments, with distinct words. If God wrote them, why are there 2 versions? The Bible calls Moses the most humble man on earth, but this phrase is in the 3rd person. Would a humble man write that about himself? These contradictions are not conspiracy theories. They are direct observations from the biblical text, and Spinoza was the first to organize them systematically, turning them into an argument that is impossible to refute. His conclusion was clear. The first 5 books of the Bible were written centuries after the events they describe, by multiple authors, with multiple agendas. Moses did not write them. And the 10 Commandments did not come from divine revelation, but from a human process of law creation, influenced by other ancient cultures, especially the Code of Hammurabi, which contains surprisingly similar rules and predates the time of Moses. But Spinoza did not stop at the destruction of the traditional narrative. He reconstructed something greater, because for him, God is not a celestial king dictating laws. God is reality itself, nature, the infinite substance of everything that exists. And the 10 Commandments do not lose value for being human. They gain value, because they prove that we have within us the capacity to create ethics, to discern good from evil, to build moral civilization without needing supernatural voices. Spinoza paid dearly for this truth. He was excommunicated at the age of 23 with the most severe curse ever pronounced against a Jew. He lived in poverty. He died young. His books were burned. But he founded modern biblical criticism. His methods are still used today in universities around the world. He inspired the Enlightenment, freedom of thought, the separation of church and state. And now you will understand exactly how he did it. In the next blocks I will show the textual evidence that Spinoza presented, the historical anachronisms, the internal contradictions, the chronological impossibilities, and the philosophical reasoning that revolutionized the world. In the end, you will have enough knowledge to think for yourself about the origin of the moral laws that govern Western civilization. Let's begin. The traditional narrative tells us the following. Moses led the Hebrews out of Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, wandered in the desert for 40 years, climbed Mount Sinai, stayed there for 40 days and 40 nights, and came down carrying 2 stone tablets with the 10 Commandments written by the finger of God. This story is the foundation of Judaism. It is accepted by Christianity. It is revered by Islam. Billions of people around the world believe that it happened exactly this way. Spinoza looked at this narrative and began to do something that no one had done before with such rigor. He read it as if it were a human text, subject to the same rules of analysis as any other historical document, not with disrespect, not with hatred, but with method. And the first thing he noticed was something disturbing. The biblical text contains statements that are impossible if Moses really wrote the Pentateuch. Let's go to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34, verses 5 to 8. The text says, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, and no one knows his grave to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his vigor abated." Read this again. The text describes the death of Moses. It describes his burial. It states that no one knows where his tomb is to this day. How can a dead man write about his own death? How can he describe his burial? How can he say that no one found his tomb to this day if he himself just died? The obvious answer is, he cannot. Someone else wrote this. Someone who lived after the death of Moses. Someone who was describing past events. But wait, if someone else wrote about the death of Moses, then who else wrote the rest of the Pentateuch? Where does Moses' text end and the text of the later editor begin? Spinoza identified this contradiction and treated it with philosophical seriousness. Because if Moses did not write everything, then the divine authority of the text begins to crumble. If there is human editing, there is human intervention. If there is human intervention, there is possible error, possible political agenda, possible intentional construction. But this is not the only contradiction. There is another even more problematic one. Numbers, chapter 12, verse 3, says, "Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth." Think about that. The text states that Moses was the most humble man on the face of the earth. But this statement is written in the third person. It is describing Moses from the outside, as if someone else were speaking about him. Would a truly humble man write about his own humility? Would he say that he is more humble than all other men on earth? Wouldn't that be the opposite of humility? The logical answer is no, a humble man would not do that. Therefore, someone else wrote this phrase, someone else was describing Moses. And if someone else wrote this, then again we have evidence that the Pentateuch was not entirely written by Moses, but compiled and edited by later authors. Spinoza was just getting started, because these two contradictions, while significant, are just the tip of the iceberg. Let's go to the book of Genesis, chapter 36, verse 31. "These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the children of Israel." Read carefully. The text speaks of kings who reigned before any king reigned over the children of Israel. This means that when this text was written, there were already kings in Israel. But Moses died before the conquest of Canaan. He died before Israel had any king. The first king of Israel was Saul, crowned centuries after the death of Moses. How could Moses write about a period before any king reigned over Israel if he died before Israel had any king? It is impossible. Logically impossible. The only coherent explanation is that this text was written during or after the period of the monarchy, when Israel already had kings. It was written by someone looking back at an earlier period. Spinoza catalogued dozens of examples like this, dozens of phrases, names of places, historical references that only make sense if the text was written centuries after the events it describes. And each example adds more weight to the inevitable conclusion. Moses did not write the Pentateuch. But if Moses did not write it, who did? And more importantly, why? Spinoza argues that the first 5 books of the Bible were compiled and edited during or after the Babylonian exile, approximately 1,000 years after the events they describe. They were written by multiple authors with multiple theological perspectives, with multiple political agendas. The goal was not to preserve factual history. The goal was to create national identity, establish religious law, justify ritual practices, consolidate priestly authority, and to do this effectively, the editors attributed the texts to Moses, the most revered, most authoritative figure in the Hebrew tradition, because if Moses said it, then God said it, and if God said it, no one can question it. But Spinoza questioned, and in doing so, he was not attacking spirituality. He was attacking the manipulation of spirituality for political and religious control. Because when you attribute your own laws to God, when you put your own words in the mouths of prophets who died centuries ago, you are committing the supreme blasphemy. You are using the name of God to impose your own will on other human beings, and this for Spinoza was unacceptable. He believed that God is nature, reality, truth, and any system that distorts the truth, even in the name of God, you are betraying the very God you claim to serve. Now you might be thinking, okay, maybe the Pentateuch was edited, maybe Moses didn't write everything, but that doesn't change the fact that he received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, right? Wrong. Because if the narrative about who wrote the text is wrong, if there is later editing and compilation, then everything in the text needs to be re-evaluated, including the holiest story of all, the revelation of the 10 Commandments. And when you start examining this narrative with critical eyes, when you apply the same logic that Spinoza applied to the rest of the text, you discover something disturbing. There are 2 different versions of the 10 Commandments in the Bible, not two identical copies, two versions with different words, distinct emphases, divergent justifications. The first is in Exodus chapter 20. The second is in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and they are not the same. Let's compare just one example, the commandment about the Sabbath. In Exodus 20 verses 8 to 11, it says, "Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." The justification here is theological. God rested on the seventh day of creation, therefore you must also rest. Now let's go to Deuteronomy 5 verses 12 to 15. "Observe the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." The justification here is historical. You were a slave in Egypt, God freed you, therefore rest on the Sabbath in memory of that liberation. These are two completely different justifications for the same commandment. If God wrote the 10 Commandments in stone with his own finger, which version did he write? The one from Exodus or the one from Deuteronomy? And why are there two versions? The traditional answer is that Moses repeated the commandments in Deuteronomy, but in his own words adapting them for a new generation. But this contradicts the narrative that God wrote the tablets. If God wrote, then the words should be exact, immutable, divine. There shouldn't be two versions. Unless the tablets never existed. Unless the story is a constructed narrative to give divine authority to laws that were, in fact, created by human beings. Spinoza did not hesitate to follow this logic to its inevitable conclusion. But there is more, much more. The commandment about honoring father and mother also presents differences between the two versions. In Exodus, it is simple and direct. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you. In Deuteronomy, the formulation is expanded. Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be prolonged and that it may go well with you in the land which the Lord your God gives you. The phrase, "that it may go well with you," is an addition that does not appear in the Exodus version. If God wrote both versions, why would there be this variation? And the commandment about not coveting presents the most significant difference. In Exodus 20, verse 17, it says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's." Note the order, first the house, then the wife. In Deuteronomy 5, verse 21, it says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's." Here the order is reversed. First the wife, then the house, and there is the addition of "nor his field," which does not appear in Exodus. These are not trivial differences. They are variations that reflect different cultural and historical contexts. They reflect different social priorities, different economic structures. The Exodus version, placing the house before the woman, reflects a more nomadic society, where physical property is more important. The Deuteronomy version, placing the woman first and adding field, reflects an established agricultural society, where arable land and family relations take precedence. This suggests that the two versions were written in different periods, for different audiences, with different social needs, and if they were written in different periods, then they did not come from a single divine revelation on Mount Sinai. They came from a gradual process of legal and religious development over centuries. Now pause for a moment. You have come this far in this investigation. You are seeing the evidence accumulate, one after another, the contradictions, the impossibilities, the variations that should not exist if the traditional story were true. What do you think about this? Does everything we were taught about the origin of divine laws need to be rethought? Is the truth about Moses and the 10 Commandments more human, more complex, more fascinating than the simplified narrative we received? Leave your comments now. After seeing this evidence, do you still believe that God wrote the 10 Commandments in stone? Or are you beginning to realize that the real story may be different? And if you are as intrigued as I am by these discoveries of Spinoza, if you want to continue this intellectual journey to the end, subscribe to this channel now, because what comes next is going to get even deeper. We will dive into historical anachronisms that are impossible to ignore. We will compare the Ten Commandments with other ancient legal codes. We will understand exactly how and why this narrative was constructed. This is not just a story about ancient texts. It is about freedom of thought. It is about having the courage to question. It is about seeking the truth, even when it challenges everything you believed. Let's continue. Spinoza identified another fundamental problem with the traditional narrative. The very story of Mount Sinai contains elements that do not make logical sense. According to Exodus chapter 19, all the people of Israel witnessed the divine revelation. God descended upon the mountain in fire, thunder, lightning, smoke. The whole mountain trembled. The entire people heard the voice of God. But then in Exodus chapter 20, verses 18 to 21, the text says that the people were so afraid of historical events, but rather a complex tapestry woven from various traditions, memories, and interpretations over time. This understanding challenges the notion of a singular divine authorship and instead highlights the human effort to make sense of their past, to create a cohesive identity, and to establish moral frameworks that resonate with their experiences. The implications of this perspective are profound, as they invite us to reconsider the nature of authority, the origins of moral laws, and the ways in which narratives shape our understanding of history and faith. The exploration of these themes reveals not only the intricacies of biblical texts, but also the enduring quest for meaning and connection within the human experience. Objective of supernatural events. It is a theological narrative created to serve specific purposes, to unify a people, establish religious authority, codify laws, create national identity, and the Ten Commandments in this context are no exception. They are an integral part of this narrative construction process. Spinoza then did something revolutionary. He compared the Ten Commandments with other legal codes from the ancient world, and what he discovered was enlightening. The Ten Commandments were not unique. They were not unprecedented. They were not a completely new revelation descending from heaven to a people who had no notion of morality. They were part of a much broader legal tradition that existed throughout the ancient Near East. The most dramatic example is the Code of Hammurabi, a set of Babylonian laws that was written approximately 300 years before the traditional period of Moses. The Code of Hammurabi contains surprisingly similar laws to the Ten Commandments and other laws from the Pentateuch. There are prohibitions against murder, theft, false testimony. There are rules about property, about marriage, about slavery. And just as the biblical narrative claims that the Ten Commandments came from God, the Code of Hammurabi claims that its laws came from the god Shamash, who revealed them to King Hammurabi. The structure is the same. A human leader receives laws from a deity, and these laws are presented as absolute, divine, immutable. This suggests that the narrative of Moses receiving laws on Mount Sinai is not a historically unique event. It is a common type of narrative in the ancient world, a way of giving divine authority to human legal codes. This does not mean that Moses copied from Hammurabi. It means that both were part of a common legal culture of the ancient Near East, where laws were often attributed to divine revelation to give them unquestionable authority. And when you examine the Ten Commandments specifically, you realize that they are not as unique as we think. You shall not murder is not a revolutionary innovation. Every society needs to prohibit murder to function. It is not divine revelation. It is a basic social necessity. You shall not steal is equally universal. There is no functional society that allows widespread theft. It is a pragmatic rule, not supernatural. You shall not bear false witness is essential for any judicial system. Without this rule, no trial can be fair. Honor your father and your mother is a rule found in virtually every human culture. It is how societies transmit knowledge, how they care for the elderly, how they maintain family cohesion. The early commandments, about worshipping only one God and not making images, are theological and specific to the emerging monotheism of the Hebrews. But even these have parallels in other cultures that emphasize the supremacy of a particular deity over others. Spinoza's point is not that the Ten Commandments are worthless. It is that they are human. They are part of a broader cultural evolution. They are the product of intelligent human beings trying to create order, justice, social cohesion. And this makes them more valuable, not less, because it means that morality does not come from an arbitrary external authority that could have commanded completely different things. Morality emerges from the very nature of reality, from the practical needs of human beings living together. We do not need stone tablets to know that killing is wrong. We know because arbitrarily destroying life destroys the possibility of society. We do not need a supernatural voice to know that stealing is wrong. We know because widespread theft makes it impossible to accumulate resources, plan for the future, trust one another. Morality is rooted in the very structure of social reality, and God for Spinoza is not separate from that structure. God is that structure. God is nature. God is the laws that govern existence. Therefore, when we follow the Ten Commandments, we are not obeying arbitrary rules imposed by a celestial despot. We are aligning our actions with the very nature of reality. And this is a spirituality much deeper than simply obeying out of fear of punishment. Spinoza also examined specific laws from the Pentateuch that go beyond the Ten Commandments and found even more direct parallels with other cultures. For example, the law of talion. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth appears in the Code of Hammurabi in almost identical form. Laws about slaves, about property, about compensation for damages, about ritual purity, all have parallels in legal codes of neighboring civilizations. This is not a coincidence. It is evidence that the Hebrews were part of a shared cultural world, influencing and being influenced by their neighbors. And when you understand this, the claim of unique divine revelation begins to crumble. Because if God was revealing laws only to the Hebrews, why do the same basic laws appear in cultures that supposedly had no contact with the true divinity? The simplest answer is that they were not independent supernatural revelations. They were shared cultural developments, practical laws that emerged from common human needs. Spinoza was not diminishing the moral importance of these laws by revealing their human origin. He was showing that morality is universal precisely because it is human, not because it is arbitrarily imposed from the outside. And this universality of morality is, for Spinoza, evidence of God, not the anthropomorphic God who dictates laws from mountains, but the God who is the very rational order of the universe. When different cultures, independently of one another, develop similar laws against murder, theft, false testimony, this does not prove that a specific God spoke to all of them. It proves that there is an objective morality rooted in the very structure of human social existence, and we access this morality not through supernatural revelations, but through reason, experience, the observation that certain actions create human flourishing and others create suffering. This is Spinoza's revolution. He secularized morality without destroying it. He showed that we can have deep, meaningful, rigorous ethics without needing to appeal to supernatural authorities. And this, in the 17th century, was supreme heresy. But today, it is the foundation of all modern secular ethical thought. Now we need to face the most difficult historical and archaeological question. Did the Exodus itself happen? Spinoza did not have access to modern archaeological methods, but he had logic, and logic presented serious problems with the literal narrative of the Exodus. According to the Book of Numbers, chapter 1, verse 46, 603,550 men, aged 20 or older, left Egypt. This does not count women, children, the elderly. If you include entire families, you are talking about approximately 2 to 3 million people. 2 to 3 million people wandering in the Sinai desert for 40 years. Think about the logistics of that, the amount of food needed, the amount of water, the size of the camps, the human and animal waste, the graves of those who died over 4 decades. A population of that size would leave massive archaeological evidence, fragments of pottery, remains of campfires, bones, tools, tombs, and yet decades of intense archaeological excavations in the Sinai have found virtually no evidence of such a large population transiting the region during that period. This does not prove that no group of Semites fled Egypt, but it proves that the numbers presented in the biblical text are dramatically inflated. What likely happened is that a much smaller group, perhaps hundreds or a few thousand people, had some kind of experience of fleeing Egypt and settling in Canaan. And over centuries of oral tradition, this event was magnified, theologized, transformed into the founding epic that we have today. Spinoza did not know the archaeological details that we know now, but he understood the principle. When a text presents impossible numbers, miraculous events without verification, and a scale of occurrences that should leave historical marks but did not, you must question the literalness of the text. And when you question the literalness of the Exodus, you necessarily question the literalness of the revelation at Sinai. Because if the overall narrative was dramatized and theologized, why would the scene on Mount Sinai be the only literal exception? The most likely answer is that it is not an exception. It is an integral part of the narrative construction process. Perhaps Moses was a real leader who established laws for his people. Perhaps he had some kind of profound spiritual experience. Perhaps he was a legal genius who synthesized rules from different traditions into a coherent code. But the story of the stone tablets written by the finger of God, of thunder and lightning, of the mountain trembling, of all the people witnessing the divine voice, that is theology, not history. It is a powerful way to give authority to the laws. It is a narrative that unites a people. It is a story that inspires reverence and obedience. But it is not a factual record of supernatural events. And Spinoza had the courage to say this out loud in the 17th century, when doing so could cost him his life. He paid the price: excommunication, rejection, poverty, premature death. But the truth he revealed did not die with him. Today, most serious biblical scholars in universities around the world accept that the Pentateuch was compiled by multiple authors over centuries. They accept that there are layers of tradition, editing, revision. It accepts that the narrative was constructed for theological and political purposes, not to be historical journalism. This is not radical. It is academic consensus. But for billions of believers around the world, it is still unacceptable heresy, because admitting that sacred texts have human origins seems to destroy their authority. But Spinoza showed the opposite. Recognizing the humanity of sacred texts does not destroy their moral authority. It simply shifts the source of that authority, from blind obedience to an external voice to the rational recognition of universal truths. Now let's examine another archaeological problem, the conquest of Canaan, described in the book of Joshua. The text presents a rapid and violent military conquest, with cities being destroyed, populations being eliminated, territories being taken in coordinated campaigns. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. Many of the cities that were supposedly destroyed by the Israelites under Joshua either did not exist during the described period, or show no signs of violent destruction at that time, or were destroyed in completely different periods. Jericho, the city whose conquest is described in the most detail, with the walls falling to the sound of trumpets, probably was not even inhabited during the period traditionally attributed to the conquest. This does not mean that there was no entry of Israelite groups into Canaan. It means that it was a much more gradual process, peaceful in some areas, conflictual in others, likely involving groups that were already partially established in the region. The narrative of total military conquest was constructed later to give glory to God, to justify territorial possession, to create a dramatic and unifying origin story. But it is not factual history. It is narrative theology. And if the conquest was theologized, if the Exodus was magnified, if the Pentateuch was compiled centuries after the events, then the revelation at Sinai also needs to be understood as theological construction, not as a literal historical event. Spinoza then asked, why was this narrative constructed? What was the political and religious purpose of attributing human laws to divine revelation? The answer has everything to do with power. When you say, this is the law I created, people can disagree. They can debate. They can argue that the law should be different. But when you say, this is the law that God revealed, you close the discussion. You make the law unquestionable. You turn political debate into blasphemy. That is the power of divine revelation. It removes the possibility of rational critique. And during the Babylonian exile, when Jewish religious leaders were trying to maintain the identity of a dispersed, fragmented people, threatened by cultural assimilation, they needed absolute authority. They needed laws that could not be questioned, narratives that would unify, practices that would distinguish Jews from their neighbors. So they took ancient traditions, practical laws, fragmented narratives, and stitched them into a sacred text. They attributed everything to Moses, presented it as divine revelation, and it worked. Judaism survived the exile, survived the destruction of the temple, survived millennia of persecution, largely because this text created a strong, cohesive, resilient identity. Spinoza was not denying the value of this survival, but he was saying that we can honor the tradition without deceiving ourselves about its origins. We can recognize that it was created by brilliant human beings responding to specific historical needs, and still find wisdom in it. But we cannot use its supposed divine origin to justify blind obedience, to silence critique, to impose outdated rules in modern contexts. Because when you understand that the laws were created by humans for specific human contexts, you also understand that they can be adapted, reinterpreted, even discarded when they no longer serve human flourishing. This was Spinoza's danger. He was giving people permission to think for themselves, to question authorities, to use reason instead of blind obedience, and this threatened the entire system of religious power that depended on unquestionable sacred texts. That is why he was excommunicated. That is why his books were banned. That is why his name was cursed. Because truth is always dangerous for systems that depend on comfortable lies. Now let's examine specific examples of how the laws of the Pentateuch reflect specific political contexts, not eternal truths. The laws about slavery in the book of Exodus allow Hebrews to own slaves. They establish rules for how slaves should be treated. They distinguish between Hebrew slaves who must be freed after 6 years and foreign slaves who can be permanent property. If these laws came from an eternal, perfectly moral God, why do they allow slavery? Why do they make distinctions based on ethnicity? The obvious answer is that these laws did not come from a perfect God. They came from imperfect human beings living in a culture where slavery was normal, trying to regulate it in a more humane way within the limits of what was culturally imaginable at the time. They are progressive laws for their time, but they are not eternally valid. And when you recognize this, you stop trying to justify biblical slavery with theological gymnastics. You simply admit that the human authors of the text had moral limitations based on their historical context. Another example, the laws about women in Deuteronomy present women as property. A raped woman must marry her rapist if he pays the proper price to her father. A woman who does not bleed on her wedding night can be stoned to death. If these laws came from God, then God is monstrously unjust to half of humanity. But if they came from men living in a deeply patriarchal society, then they make historical sense, horrible sense, but understandable within the context. And we can reject these laws without completely rejecting the tradition. We can say, yes, they were wrong about this. Their culture limited their morality. But in other areas, such as the emphasis on justice for the poor and the foreigner, they got it right. We can be selective, critical, rational. We can take what is wise and reject what is cruel. But we can only do this if we admit that the text is human, not divine. And that is exactly what Spinoza taught. Use reason to evaluate sacred texts. Do not accept anything just because it is written. Ask, does this promote human flourishing? Is this just? Does this make sense? If so, accept it. If not, reject it. That is the essence of moral autonomy, to think for oneself. Now we come to the deeper question. If the 10 Commandments did not come from God in the traditional way, then what is God for Spinoza? This question is crucial, because Spinoza was not an atheist. He was not denying God. He was completely redefining what the word God means. For Spinoza, God is not a being separate from creation. He is not a celestial king sitting on a throne giving orders. He is not a person who thinks, feels, decides, rewards, punishes. God is the very substance of reality. God is nature. God is everything that exists, operating according to necessary, eternal, immutable laws. When you understand the laws of physics, you are understanding God. When you comprehend logic, you are comprehending God. When you live according to reason, you are living according to the nature of God. There is no separation between God and the world. There is no down here and up there. There is only one reality, one substance, operating according to its own necessary nature. And human beings are part of that substance. We are modes of God, finite expressions of the infinite. When we use reason, when we discern truth, when we act ethically, we are not obeying external commands. We are expressing our own deeper nature, which is part of the nature of God. Morality, therefore, is not arbitrary. It is not a list of rules that God could have made differently if he wanted. It is based on the very structure of reality. You shall not kill is not moral because God commanded it. God commanded it, or rather reality is such that, because killing destroys the possibility of flourishing, of cooperation, of society. Morality is rooted in what Spinoza calls conatus, the effort of each thing to persevere in its being. Human beings flourish in cooperative societies. They flourish when there is trust, justice, order. They do not flourish in chaos, violence, betrayal. Therefore, the laws that promote cooperation, do not kill, do not steal, do not lie, are aligned with our own nature, with our own well-understood rational interest. We do not need stone tablets to know this. We need reason. And when Moses, or whoever created these laws, formulated the 10 Commandments, he was expressing deep human wisdom about what makes societies function. He was doing what Spinoza calls following the natural light, the innate reason that we all possess. Attributing this to supernatural revelation does not add real authority. It only adds the appearance of authority for those who do not trust their own reason. But Spinoza trusts reason, because reason is not something separate from God. Reason is how God operates in finite minds. When you think clearly, when you understand truth, you are participating in the infinite mind of God. This is a much deeper spirituality than simply obeying the rules of an ancient book. It is a spirituality of understanding, of alignment with reality, of intellectual love for the infinite. Spinoza calls this amor Dei intellectualis, the intellectual love of God. It is what we feel when we understand a profound truth, when we see the mathematical order of the universe, when we comprehend how everything is connected, that feeling of admiration, of reverence in the face of the complexity and beauty of the cosmos. That is genuine spirituality. It does not require miracles. It does not need supernatural revelations. It does not need sacred texts protected from criticism. It only requires open eyes, a clear mind, an honest heart. And when you live this way, when you seek truth above comfort, when you use reason above blind tradition, you are living ethically, not because you will be rewarded in heaven or punished in hell, but because it is your deepest nature, your own essence as a rational being. This is Spinoza's revolution. He completely internalized morality. There is no external judge. There is only the very nature of reality, and you can align yourself with it or not. When you align, you flourish. When you go against it, you suffer, not due to arbitrary divine punishment, but due to inevitable natural consequences. Killing leads to cycles of revenge. Stealing destroys social trust. Lying corrodes relationships. These are not punishments imposed from the outside. They are inherent consequences of actions. And understanding this is understanding the true basis of morality. So what does all this mean for how we live today? Spinoza freed us from the need to ground morality in ancient texts of dubious origin. But he did not leave us without a moral compass. On the contrary, he gave us a more solid foundation, reason itself, the very nature of reality. When you understand that the 10 Commandments did not come from God dictating on a mountain, you do not lose moral guidance. You gain clarity about where morality truly comes from. It comes from our social nature, from our ability to reason about consequences, from our recognition that individual flourishing is linked to collective flourishing. You shall not kill does not need supernatural authority. It only requires the recognition that you do not want to be killed, and therefore, by rational reciprocity, you should not kill. You shall not steal does not need stone tablets. It only requires the understanding that societies where property is respected function better than societies of widespread theft. You shall not bear false witness does not need a divine voice. It only requires the perception that trust is the foundation of all human cooperation. These truths are self-evident to any rational being. The fact that cultures around the world, regardless of their religions, arrive at similar moral conclusions proves this. Morality is universal, not because a particular God revealed it. It is universal because it is rooted in the very nature of human social existence. And this is liberating. Because it means you do not need religious intermediaries to access moral truth. You have reason. You can think for yourself. You can look at an ancient law and ask, does this still serve human flourishing? If so, keep it. If not, change it. You can look at religious practices and ask, does this promote wisdom, compassion, justice? If so, value it. If not, abandon it. You do not have to accept slavery because it is in the Bible. You do not have to accept the subordination of women because it is in the Pentateuch. You do not have to accept cruel punishments because they are in sacred texts. You can use your own moral reason, your own conscience, your own sense of justice. And this is not arrogance, it is responsibility. Because if you attribute your moral decisions to God, to sacred texts, to religious authorities, you are evading responsibility. You are saying, it is not me who chooses this, it is God. It is not me who thinks this way, it is tradition. But Spinoza says, no, you are responsible. You have reason. Use it. If you oppress others, it is your choice. Do not blame God. Do not blame sacred texts. Take responsibility. If you promote justice, it is your choice. Do not attribute it to external authorities. Recognize your own moral agency. This is the moral maturity that Spinoza offers, to leave the childhood of blind obedience and enter the adulthood of autonomous thinking. And yes, this is scary, because it means you have no excuses. You cannot say, I was just following divine orders when you do harm. You have to look in the mirror and admit, I chose this. I am responsible. But it also means that when you do good, it is genuinely yours. It is not the merit of obeying an external command. It is an expression of your own rational and compassionate nature. Spinoza paid a brutal price for teaching this. He was excommunicated, rejected. He lived in poverty, died young, but he changed the world, inspired the Enlightenment, influenced thinkers from Kant to Einstein, founded modern biblical criticism, paved the way for freedom of thought, for liberal democracy, for the separation of church and state, all because he had the courage to ask a simple question: where do the Ten Commandments really come from? And the answer he discovered did not destroy morality. It purified it. It did not destroy spirituality. It deepened it. It did not destroy God. It freed God from the conceptual prisons in which theologians had locked him. Today, you have the same choice that Spinoza had: to accept comfortable answers without questioning, or to seek truth even when it is uncomfortable. You can continue believing that Moses went up a mountain and came back with tablets written by the finger of God. No one can stop you. But if you have honestly looked at the evidence presented in this video, the internal contradictions, the historical anachronisms, the two versions of the commandments, the chronological impossibilities, the parallels with other ancient legal codes, you know that the literal story does not hold up. And when you admit this, you do not lose anything of real value. You gain clarity. You gain the freedom to value what is wise in the Ten Commandments without having to defend what is problematic in the rest of the text. You gain the ability to adapt morality to modern contexts instead of being trapped by the rules of ancient cultures. You gain the responsibility to think for yourself, to be an autonomous moral agent. And this, in the end, is what Spinoza gave us. Not easy answers, but tools to find our own answers. Not comfortable obedience, but frightening freedom. Not blind faith, but honest search for truth. And if you have made it this far, if you have followed this deep dive into Spinoza's analysis of Moses and the Ten Commandments, you have already taken the first step on this journey of intellectual autonomy. The rest is up to you. Now let us examine one of the most controversial questions that Spinoza raised. If Moses did not receive the Ten Commandments from God, then what happened to the idea of prophecy? To understand this, we first need to understand what the religious tradition claims about prophets. According to the traditional view, prophets are special individuals chosen by God to receive direct messages. God speaks to them through dreams, visions, audible voices. And these messages are infallible because they come directly from the divine source. Moses is presented as the greatest of all prophets. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 10 says, "And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Face to face. Direct communication. No intermediaries, no ambiguity. This statement places Moses in a unique category. Other prophets received visions and dreams that needed to be interpreted. But Moses spoke with God as a man speaks with his friend. Spinoza looked at this statement and asked a devastating question. What does it mean to say that God spoke to Moses face to face? Does God have a face? Does God have a voice? Does God produce sound waves in the air that enter human ears and are processed by the brain? If you answer yes to these questions, then you are anthropomorphizing God in a way that makes no philosophical sense. You are reducing the infinite to an enlarged human form. If you answer no, then you need to explain what really happened when Moses supposedly spoke with God. Spinoza argues that prophecy is not supernatural communication. It is exceptionally vivid imagination combined with deep moral wisdom. Prophets were individuals with powerful imagination who could visualize moral and social truth so vividly that they felt as if they were receiving messages from an external source. But the source was not external. It was internal. It was their own mind, their own moral consciousness, their own ability to intuit what is right. And because they lived in cultures where God was understood as the explanation for everything that is good and true, they naturally attributed their moral intuitions to divine communication. This does not mean they were lying. It means they were interpreting internal experiences through the conceptual categories available in their culture. When Moses had the intuition that his people needed laws to survive as a community, when he realized that without basic rules about not killing, not stealing, not lying, they would destroy themselves, he experienced this as a revelation, and in a certain sense it was a revelation. It was genuine truth emerging in his consciousness, but it was not God speaking from the outside. It was Moses' own reason, his own wisdom, his own ability to see what is necessary for human flourishing. Spinoza gives examples of other prophets. God, then how can any particular group of people be chosen over others? This notion implies a limitation on God's nature, suggesting that he favors one group at the expense of others. Spinoza argues that such an idea is not only theologically problematic, but also morally dangerous. It fosters division, superiority, and conflict among different peoples and cultures. By recognizing the human construction of the narrative surrounding Moses and the chosen people, we can begin to dismantle the harmful implications of divine favoritism. Instead of viewing the Jewish people as uniquely selected by God, we can understand them as part of the broader human experience, sharing in the quest for justice, morality, and truth. This perspective encourages inclusivity rather than exclusivity, promoting a vision of humanity united in its diversity. Spinoza's insights challenge us to rethink our understanding of religious identity and the implications of claiming divine endorsement. If we abandon the idea of a chosen people, we open ourselves to a more universal approach to ethics and morality, one that transcends cultural and religious boundaries. This shift allows for a more compassionate and equitable society, where the focus is on shared human values rather than divisive doctrines. Moreover, Spinoza's philosophy invites us to appreciate the richness of various cultural traditions, without elevating one above the others. Each tradition can contribute to our understanding of moral truths, and by engaging with diverse perspectives, we can cultivate a more profound and nuanced ethical framework. This approach fosters dialogue and cooperation among different cultures, enabling us to work together toward common goals. In this light, the story of Moses and the Ten Commandments can be seen not as a unique revelation, but as a significant contribution to the ongoing human endeavor to articulate principles of justice and morality. The commandments themselves, while rooted in a specific historical context, encapsulate fundamental truths about human society that resonate across cultures and eras. Spinoza's challenge to the notion of divine election ultimately leads us to a more egalitarian view of humanity. It encourages us to recognize our shared responsibility for one another and to seek justice and compassion in our interactions. By moving beyond the confines of a chosen people, we can embrace a more expansive vision of community that honors the dignity and worth of every individual. This reimagining of religious narratives has profound implications for how we approach contemporary issues of social justice, equality, and human rights. It compels us to confront the ways in which religious beliefs have been used to justify discrimination and violence throughout history. By acknowledging the human origins of these narratives, we can work toward a more just and inclusive society that values the contributions of all people, regardless of their background. In conclusion, Spinoza's critique of the idea of a chosen people serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of humility in our moral and spiritual pursuits. It calls us to recognize the limitations of our perspectives and to remain open to the wisdom of others. By doing so, we can foster a more compassionate and just world, grounded in the shared values that unite us as human beings. All reality, then, God has no arbitrary preferences. God does not look at different human groups and decide that he likes one more than another. This kind of thinking attributes to God characteristics that are too human: favoritism, tribalism, unfair partiality. But the God of Spinoza is not like that. The God of Spinoza is nature itself, operating through necessary laws that apply equally to all. There are no chosen peoples. There are only human beings, all equally part of the divine substance, all equally capable of using reason, all equally subject to the same natural and moral laws. So how does Spinoza explain the biblical passages about divine election? He argues that when the texts speak of Israel as chosen, they are not making a metaphysical statement about divine favoritism. They are expressing national pride, cultural identity, a sense of collective mission. It is like when any nation says, "We are the best country in the world," or "We have a manifest destiny." It is a statement of collective self-esteem, not an objective truth about the divine hierarchy of peoples. And in its historical context, this statement served a useful purpose. It allowed a small, often oppressed people to maintain a distinct identity amidst powerful empires. It allowed them to survive exile, dispersion, persecution. But Spinoza says that now, with mature philosophical understanding, we can recognize this doctrine for what it is: a human tool for cultural survival, not a metaphysical truth about the structure of the cosmos. And when you recognize this, you can honor what was useful about the idea without perpetuating what is harmful. What is useful: a sense of collective identity, a commitment to transmit values and wisdom through generations, pride in cultural contributions. What is harmful: superiority over other peoples, justification of violence against infidels, inability to recognize moral truth in other traditions. Spinoza was essentially universalizing morality. He was saying that fundamental moral truths do not belong to any specific people. They belong to humanity. "You shall not kill" is true for Jews and Gentiles. "You shall not steal" applies to everyone. Compassion, justice, honesty are universal values, not tribal property. And when you understand this, you can learn from all traditions. You can recognize wisdom in multiple cultures. You can value diversity instead of insisting on uniformity. This view was radical for the 17th century. It is still radical for many today, because admitting that your own tradition does not have a monopoly on truth requires humility. It requires a willingness to learn from others. It requires abandoning a sense of superiority. But this intellectual humility is precisely what Spinoza is asking for, and he practiced what he preached. He studied not only Jewish texts, but also Greek philosophy, Christian thought, Islamic ideas. He recognized truth wherever he found it. This intellectual openness is what allowed him to see beyond the limits of his own tradition, but it is also what cost him dearly. Because religious communities often value loyalty above truth. They value tribal cohesion above intellectual honesty. And when you are honest enough to say, "My tradition was wrong about this," you are seen as a traitor. Spinoza was excommunicated not because he was wrong, but because he was right in a way that threatened structures of power and community identity. Now there is another aspect of the chosen people issue that Spinoza addresses: the promise of land. God supposedly promised Canaan to the descendants of Abraham, and this promise has been used for millennia to justify territorial claims, conquest, even ethnic cleansing. Spinoza looks at this narrative and asks, are divine promises conditional or unconditional? According to Deuteronomy, the promise of land was conditioned on obedience to the laws. If the people obeyed, they would prosper in the land. If they disobeyed, they would be exiled. And the Babylonian exile was interpreted by the prophets themselves as the fulfillment of this condition. The people disobeyed, therefore they lost the land. So the promise was not unconditional, it was a contract. If you do X, you will receive Y. And when you understand this as a political religious contract, not as an eternal metaphysical decree, then the situation changes completely. There is no eternal divine claim over a specific territory. There is only a complex human history of migrations, conquests, exiles, returns. A history that needs to be negotiated justly, not with appeals to supposedly absolute divine promises. Spinoza was undermining theological justifications for nationalism and imperialism. He was saying that we cannot resolve complex territorial disputes by appealing to sacred texts. We have to use reason, diplomacy, justice. This does not automatically resolve conflicts, but it removes an important obstacle, the idea that God is on a specific side, that territory is sacred, that compromise is impossible because you would be betraying a divine mandate. When you remove that theological element, you open space for rational negotiation based on real human needs, not on interpretations of ancient promises. We now come to one of the most practical questions. If you accept Spinoza's analysis, what do you do with religious texts? Do you simply discard them? Do you stop reading them? Do you treat them as irrelevant? Spinoza's answer is nuanced and important. He does not say that sacred texts are useless. He says we should read them correctly, understanding what they are and what they are not. Sacred texts are not scientific manuals. When Genesis says that God created the world in 6 days, it is not making a literal cosmological statement. It is using poetic narrative to express theological truths, that there is order in the cosmos, that reality is good, that there is a rhythm of work and rest embedded in nature. You can accept these theological truths without having to reject billions of years of cosmic evolution. Sacred texts are not factual history books. When they narrate miraculous events, they are not reporting objective journalism. They are using dramatic language to express religious meaning. The parting of the Red Sea may be a cultural memory of a dramatic crossing during low tide, or it may be a metaphor for liberation from oppression. Either way, the message is about freedom, not about physics. Sacred texts are wisdom literature. They contain profound insights about the human condition, about morality, about the search for meaning. But these insights are mixed with outdated cultural elements, with factual errors, with prejudices of ancient societies. The task of the mature reader is to separate what is wise from what is merely cultural, what is eternal from what is temporal, what promotes flourishing from what promotes suffering. And you do not need religious authority to make that separation. You need reason, empathy, and a developed moral sense. Spinoza offers a method of reading. Approach sacred texts as you would approach any other ancient text, with respect for their wisdom, but also with critical eyes for their limits. When you read Plato, you do not accept everything he says about slavery just because he was a great philosopher. You take what is wise about the theory of forms and reject what is regressive about social structure. The same goes for biblical texts. Take what is wise about justice, compassion, and the search for meaning. Reject what is cruel about slavery, genocide, and the subordination of women. It is not disrespectful to do this. It is honest. And honesty is what sacred texts should inspire, not blind obedience. There is also another value in religious texts that Spinoza recognizes. They have shaped cultures. They have influenced art, literature, music, philosophy for millennia. To understand Western civilization, you need to know the Bible, not because it is the infallible word of God, but because it is a foundational text that has informed so much of our collective thought. Biblical references permeate Shakespeare, Milton, Dostoevsky. Biblical themes inspired Michelangelo, Bach, Rembrandt. Biblical concepts shaped political theories of Locke, human rights of Jefferson, social justice movements of Martin Luther King. You cannot understand these cultural achievements without knowing the texts that inspired them. But knowing is not the same as accepting literally. You can appreciate the beauty and depth of religious texts while recognizing their human origins and their limits. And there is another aspect that Spinoza values: the rituals and practices that grew around these texts. Rituals serve important psychological and social functions. They create a sense of community. They mark life transitions. They offer moments of reflection amid the chaos of everyday life. You do not need to literally believe in the narrative of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments to value the weekly ritual of rest on the Sabbath. You can recognize the practical wisdom of pausing, reflecting, reconnecting with values amid the rush. You do not need to believe in a literal resurrection to value celebrations of renewal in spring. You can appreciate the metaphor of death and rebirth without treating it as biology. Spinoza is not asking you to abandon everything associated with religion. He is asking you to keep what has real value and let go of what does not. And the distinction is based on consequences. Practices that promote well-being, community, reflection, compassion are valuable. Practices that promote superstition, fear, exclusion, cruelty should be abandoned. It is not complicated, but it requires honesty and courage. Honesty to admit when traditions are wrong. Courage to change practices even when they carry the weight of centuries. And perhaps the most important aspect that Spinoza highlights about religious texts, they connect us with past generations. When you read the same texts that your ancestors read, when you sing the same songs, when you celebrate the same festivals, you are participating in a continuity that spans centuries. There is something profoundly significant about this continuity, about knowing that you are part of a much larger story than your own life. This does not require literal belief. It only requires appreciation for cultural heritage, for accumulated wisdom, for the struggles and achievements of those who came before. Spinoza never denied the value of this. He only insisted that we must be honest about what we are doing. We are not accessing truths revealed supernaturally. We are participating in rich and complex human traditions. And when we are honest about this, we can value traditions without idolizing them. We can respect ancestors without reproducing their mistakes. We can honor the past while building a better future. Now let's get to the heart of the existential question. If God did not give the 10 Commandments, if there is no supernatural revelation, if morality is human, then does life have meaning? Is there purpose? Or are we just navigating an indifferent universe without a real compass? This is the anguish that many people feel when confronting Spinoza's analysis, because it seems like he is pulling the ground from under your feet. It seems like he is leaving you adrift in a meaningless cosmos. But this is a profound misunderstanding of what Spinoza is really saying. For Spinoza, the universe is not indifferent. The universe is God. Every atom, every star, every thought, every act of kindness is an expression of the divine. There is no separation between sacred and secular. Everything is sacred because everything is part of the infinite substance we call God or nature. When you understand a mathematical truth, you are knowing the mind of God. When you act with compassion, you are expressing the nature of God. When you seek justice, you are aligned with the divine order of the universe. Meaning does not come from obeying arbitrary commands from an external deity. Meaning comes from understanding your own nature as part of the infinite whole, and from living according to that nature. For Spinoza, human beings are, in essence, rational beings. Reason is our distinctive characteristic, our most direct connection to the divine. When we use reason to understand the world, to create justice, to develop science, art, philosophy, we are fulfilling our highest purpose. We do not need a divine manual to tell us our purpose. Our purpose is inscribed in our own nature. And when we live according to that nature, when we think clearly, when we act ethically, when we seek truth, we experience what Spinoza calls beatitude. Beatitude is not superficial pleasure. It is deep joy that comes from being aligned with the very structure of reality. It is what we feel when we understand something difficult, when we act with integrity, when we experience beauty. This joy does not depend on external rewards. It is not about heaven after death. It is about quality of life here and now. And paradoxically, when you stop seeking meaning outside of yourself, when you stop waiting for God to tell you what to do, you find deeper meaning within yourself. Because you become an active agent of meaning, not a passive recipient, you create value through your choices, your actions, your relationships. There is no predetermined script. There is no divine plan that you need to discover. There is only you, your reason, your capacity to choose, and an infinite universe of possibilities. Is that scary? Yes. But it is also liberating, because it means you are not bound to a predefined role. You are not limited by the expectations of religious authorities about how you should live. You have genuine freedom, and with that freedom comes genuine responsibility. You are the author of your own life. And the story you write, the way you treat others, the legacy you leave, that depends on you, not on God dictating from the outside, but on you choosing from the inside. Spinoza argues that when you deeply understand this, when you truly internalize that you are part of the infinite nature of God, experiencing reality through your particular point of view, something changes. You stop fearing death, because you understand that as part of the eternal substance, your essence cannot be destroyed. Only your particular manifestation as a finite individual has a beginning and an end. You stop feeling resentment, because you understand that everything happens according to natural necessity. There is no capricious deity to blame. There are only natural laws operating. You stop seeking external validation, because you find validation in your own rational understanding and ethical action. This is a deeply immanent spirituality. It does not seek transcendence to another world. It seeks depth in this world. It does not seek to escape nature. It seeks to understand and embrace nature, including your own nature. And there is something incredibly liberating about this, because it means that the sacred is not distant, not separate, not accessible only through religious intermediaries. The sacred is here, now, in every breath, in every clear thought, in every act of kindness. You do not need to go to a special place or perform a special ritual to access God. You live and move and have your being in God constantly. This is Spinoza's spiritual revolution. He brought the divine back to the world, back to the body, back to reason. Traditional religion often treats the physical world as inferior, the body as a prison, reason as dangerous. It values blind faith above intelligent questioning. Spinoza inverts this. The physical world is a manifestation of God. The body is a mode of God. Reason is our most direct connection to the divine. And when you understand this, you do not need the 10 Commandments written in stone to know how to live. You have something better, rational understanding of your own nature and the nature of reality. You shall not kill not because an external authority prohibited it, but because you understand that killing contradicts your own rational and compassionate nature. You shall not steal not out of fear of punishment, but because you freely choose to live with integrity. You do good not out of obedience, but out of understanding. And this is adult, mature, genuine morality. We have reached the end of this journey through Spinoza's revolutionary analysis of Moses and the 10 Commandments. It is time to tie all the threads together and understand what all this really means. Spinoza proved through textual evidence, historical anachronisms, internal contradictions, and rigorous philosophical analysis that Moses did not receive the 10 Commandments from God in the literal way that tradition claims. The first 5 books of the Bible were not written by Moses. They were compiled centuries later by multiple authors with multiple agendas. The narrative of revelation on Mount Sinai is not factual history, but narrative theology. The 10 Commandments are not unique or unprecedented, but part of a broader legal tradition of the ancient Near East. These conclusions, based on solid evidence, destroy the traditional narrative of literal divine revelation. But here is the crucial point that many miss. Spinoza was not destroying spirituality. He was purifying it. Because when you remove the layer of invented supernatural authority, when you strip away the false aura of literal divine origin, what you find is not emptiness. You find something deeper, humanity in its highest form. The 10 Commandments represent the human capacity to discern good from evil through reason. They represent accumulated wisdom about what makes societies function. They represent the conscious choice to create order, justice, compassion, amid the potential chaos of existence, and that is more impressive than if they came from God. Because it means that we, finite, imperfect human beings, have within us the capacity to create ethics, to seek justice, to build civilization. We do not need supernatural authorities. We have reason, we have consciousness, we have the capacity to learn and grow. Spinoza did not take meaning out of the world. He returned responsibility to us. We can no longer blame God for unjust laws. We can no longer say, I was just obeying divine orders when we do wrong. We can no longer hide behind religious authority when we should be thinking for ourselves. We have to take ownership of our moral choices. And this is scary, but it is also empowering, because it means that when we do good, it is genuinely ours. When we create justice, it is our achievement. When we build a better society, it is our triumph. Spinoza showed that we can have deep, meaningful, rigorous morality without needing supernatural revelation. We can have deep spirituality without needing religious dogma. We can have connection to the divine through reason, not through blind obedience. Your God is not a distant person dictating rules. Your God is reality itself, nature, the substance of everything that exists, and we are part of that. Not separate, not inferior, but finite modes of the infinite. When we understand this, when we truly internalize this vision, everything changes. Death is no longer terrifying because you understand that your essence is part of the eternal. Suffering is no longer meaningless because you understand that it is part of the necessary complexity of finite reality. Morality is no longer an external burden, but an expression of your own higher nature. And freedom is no longer doing whatever you want arbitrarily, but acting according to a rational understanding of your own nature and the nature of the world. This is genuine freedom, not absence of law, but alignment with the rational law that you understand and choose freely. The Ten Commandments, understood correctly, are not arbitrary restrictions. They are expressions of wisdom about how to live well. And you do not need Moses climbing a mountain to access that wisdom. You need reason, reflection, experience. But here is the challenge. It is easier to obey than to think. It is more comfortable to have authorities telling you what to do than to have to decide for yourself. It is less scary to have absolute rules than to have to navigate moral complexity with your own reason. That is why many people resist Spinoza. That is why he was excommunicated. That is why his books were burned. That is why even today, centuries later, his ideas still disturb. Because he is asking you to grow, to leave the childhood of obedience and enter the adulthood of autonomy, to stop seeking security in false certainties and embrace the responsibility of genuine uncertainty. And that is difficult, it is frightening, it is laborious, but it is the only path to genuine freedom, to genuine morality, to genuine spirituality. Spinoza paid a brutal price for this truth. He was rejected by the community that should have protected him. He lived in poverty. He died young. His books were considered too dangerous to exist, but the truth he discovered did not die with him. It grew. It spread. It transformed the world. It inspired the Enlightenment. It influenced the foundation of modern democracies. It paved the way for freedom of thought, for the separation of church and state, for human rights based on universal reason, not on particular revelation. Everything we value about modernity, freedom of conscience, equality before the law, the right to question authority, has roots in the kind of thinking that Spinoza exemplified. And today, you are faced with the same choice he faced, to continue with comfortable but false narratives, or to embrace uncomfortable but liberating truth. You can continue believing that Moses went up the mountain and came back with tablets written by the finger of God. No one can force you to change your mind. But if you have been honest with yourself during this journey, if you have truly looked at the evidence presented, the internal contradictions, the historical anachronisms, the two versions of the commandments, the chronological impossibilities, the parallels with other ancient legal codes, you know that the literal narrative does not hold up. And when you admit that, you lose nothing of real value. You gain clarity, you gain freedom, you gain responsibility. You can stop trying to defend the indefensible in sacred texts. You can take what is wise and leave what is problematic. You can adapt morality to modern contexts instead of being stuck to rules from ancient cultures. You can, finally, think for yourself. And that is what Spinoza always wanted. Not that you blindly accept his conclusions, but that you use your own reason to arrive at your own conclusions. If you have examined the evidence and still want to believe in the traditional narrative, that is your choice. But at least now it is a conscious choice, not automatic acceptance. And if you have examined the evidence and concluded that Spinoza was right, then you have work ahead. The work of living as a moral autonomous being, of building meaning without supernatural supports, of creating justice through reason and compassion, not through obedience to authorities. It is harder work, but it is more honest work. And in the end, it is more rewarding work, because it means that when you do good, it is yours. When you create beauty, it is yours. When you seek truth, it is your journey. You are not a puppet of religious authorities or arbitrary divine command. You are a free, responsible, rational agent. And that is the true human dignity that Spinoza wanted to give us. So this is Spinoza's legacy regarding Moses and the Ten Commandments, not the destruction of morality, but its grounding on more solid foundations. Not the death of God, but the transformation of what God means. Not the end of spirituality, but its rebirth in a more mature form. Moses may not have received stone tablets on Mount Sinai, but human beings through generations, through cultures, through reason and experience, have discovered moral truths that allow us to live together with justice and compassion. And that is the greatest, most impressive, most reverent achievement than any supernatural miracle could ever be, because it is our achievement, our wisdom, our choice to create light instead of darkness, order instead of chaos, goodness instead of cruelty. And now that you understand this, you can go out and live according to this understanding, not obeying blindly, but choosing freely, not out of fear of punishment, but out of love for truth. That is Spinoza's invitation. That is Spinoza's challenge. That is Spinoza's gift. And it is up to you to decide what to do with it.